She fled the war with nothing but her baby. But when a silent billionaire took her in, the frontier would never be the same. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. The prairie sky was red the day she fled. Red from the fires of a town burning behind her. Red from the sun bleeding over the hills. Red from the blood she had not the strength to wash from her hands. Her name was Rosalini Cade, once a teacher in a peaceful border village nestled along the New Mexico territories until the war turned it into a graveyard. Now she was just another shadow in exile, barefoot on cracked ground, carrying a swaddled infant too quiet to be healthy. She had walked for miles before she realized she was bleeding through her boots. Her steps were numb. The world had narrowed into the weight of the baby girl against her chest and the sound of wind whipping through thorn brush. When the raid began, there was no time to say goodbye. One moment, she had been reciting letters with wide-eyed schoolchildren. The next, men on horseback had stormed the streets with rifles and flames. They said it was retaliation, frontier justice, collateral. But to Rosalini, it was a massacre. She had seen her neighbors dragged, her sister-in-law shot, her home turned to embers. That night, under a tree too thin to offer real shelter, she pressed her baby closer and whispered promises no one could hear. She didn't know where she was going, only that the past couldn't follow. But war doesn't end when the guns go quiet. It haunts in memories, in guilt, in the dead she couldn't bury. Rosalini had seen too much to believe in salvation. Yet the land had other plans. At sunrise, she crossed the edge of a desolate cattle trail. Dust rose behind her like ghosts. Every time she blinked, she saw the church burning again, the old cross falling into ash. Her baby whimpered, a sound like paper tearing. Her milk had dried 2 days ago. And then she collapsed. Not from the heat, not from hunger, but from the realization that no one was coming, except someone was. High on the ridge, behind a veil of dust and mesquite, sat a man watching from the seat of a coal-black carriage that didn't belong on a trail like this. The horses were too well-bred, the wheels too clean, and the man inside didn't wear a sheriff's badge or a rancher's boots. He was dressed in the kind of wool coat, stitched in the East and cut for those who never knew poverty. He looked down at Rosaline's form curled on the dirt and said nothing. Just tapped his driver's shoulder once. An hour later, Rosalini woke in a bed she didn't recognize. Her baby beside her, a clean cloth pressed to the infant's lips. The room was candlelit. The walls were sandstone, and something was burning. In a hearth somewhere, say Darwood, warm and expensive. She panicked, reached for her child, but found her arm held in linen wrappings. Her mind tried to resist, but her body gave in again, and she slept. It was 3 days before she fully awoke. By then, she was in a house bigger than any she'd ever seen. It wasn't a ranch. It wasn't a hotel. It was something else entirely, a fortress built against the wind, isolated and sprawling. From her window, the desert stretched endlessly, broken only by oil derricks that pierced the sky like skeleton towers. Men in white hats moved quietly among them, but none of them looked up. And the man who owned them, the one who had found her, remained unseen. Rosalini ate in silence, washed in silence, healed in silence. But questions grew like weeds. Why would an oil tycoon rescue a stranger with nothing? Why would a man with wealth this vast build a home in exile? And why had he not asked for her name? As the days turned to weeks, Rosalini grew stronger. Her baby, now fed and clean, began to cry again, which to her was a miracle. Still, she never left the house. Something in her didn't trust freedom. She had once believed the world was kind, and look where it had led her. But behind every closed door in the mansion, secrets pulsed. A photograph on the mantel had its face scratched out. A locked room on the west wing echoed when no one was near. And at night, when all should have been quiet, Rosalini would hear footsteps in the floorboards above her. She wasn't alone. The silence in the oil tycoon's mansion was unnatural. It didn't feel peaceful. It felt rehearsed. Like everyone within the walls had been trained to avoid the sound of life. Rossellini moved from room to room as if walking through a mausoleum. Everything was pristine satin drapes, wax floors, trimmed flowers that never seemed to die. But no warmth. No photographs that smiled. No evidence that children ever laughed here. Only shadows that lingered too long and corners that whispered. She began noticing things. The elderly maid who served her wouldn't meet her eyes. The cook hummed a hymn Rossellini once heard sung at funerals. And always, as if orchestrated, the man who owned the place never crossed her path. She didn't know his name, only that the staff referred to him as the benefactor. He lived upstairs in the West Wing, the one with locked doors and cold drafts. She once crept close, curious, but stopped when she saw the claw marks on the banister. They were real, deep, and looked like they were carved during some moment of madness. She went back to her room and didn't try again. Outside, the oil fields groaned day and night. Machinery ran like it was mourning something. And the workers? They moved like prisoners, careful, silent, obedient. No one laughed. No one shouted. It was as if the entire estate was stitched together by fear. But fear of what? Then came the day Rossellini received a letter left without a signature on the dining tray. It contained no message, only a date and time. Midnight. Library. West. Wing. Her instincts screamed to ignore it. But another part of her, the one that still burned with the need for answers, forced her to obey. That night, she slipped down the marble stairs and across the black-tiled floor, every step echoing louder than the last. When she opened the library door, the candlelight flickered like it knew a secret. And there, seated by the fire with his back turned, was the benefactor. He didn't rise when she entered. He didn't turn. He simply pointed to the chair across from him. Rossellini didn't sit. She stood by the doorway, watching his silhouette, tall, built like someone who had known labor before luxury. His coat was made of something foreign, and his hair hung in waves just touching his collar. But what drew her eyes most was the scar that cut down the side of his neck, partially hidden by the firelight. Old, brutal, almost surgical. Without a word, he reached beside him and dropped something onto the table. It was her baby's birth bracelet, the one she thought lost in the chaos of the war. He had gone back to the village after the massacre dot, and suddenly the pieces began to crumble into place. The benefactor had once lived there. He had once loved there. And whatever happened in that village wasn't just war. It was personal. He hadn't saved Rossellini by chance. He had known who she was, known what had happened, maybe even known who she had lost. She fled the room before he could speak. She spent the next 2 days pacing her quarters, feeding her child in a daze. Her hands shook constantly. Her breath came in gasps. She hadn't cried when her sister-in-law was gunned down in front of the chapel. She hadn't cried when she watched her house collapse into flames. But now, alone in this mansion filled with ghosts, she wept like a river that had been dammed too long. On the 3rd morning, the West Wing was open. It should have felt like an invitation. It felt like a warning. Rossellini stepped into the corridor lined with oil portraits, none of which had eyes. The faces were blurred, painted over, distorted as if the artist had tried to forget what they'd seen. She passed a room filled with unopened crates marked from foreign ports. One door was sealed with iron, another with leather straps. Finally, at the hall's end, she found a study, and in it, pages pinned to walls, maps, photographs, names. Her village was on the center, board. So was hers. Circled in ink. This wasn't just a sanctuary. This was a mission. And he wasn't just an oil tycoon. He was something else. Something forged in grief and vengeance. A man who had buried a version of himself and rebuilt from the bones of those who had wronged him. Rossellini realized, standing in that study, that the mansion was not a home. It was a machine. A machine built to remember what the world wanted forgotten. And she, along with her child, was now part of it. The study haunted Rossellini long after she left it, in her sleep. She could still see the black and white photographs pinned to corkboards, the names crossed out with red ink, and the faded map of their ruined village at the center of it all. Her name had been circled, not once, but 3 times, each time darker, as though whoever marked it was struggling not to forget her face. There had been other names to some she recognized. Mr. Corbin, the general storekeeper, Widow Emmeline, her old headmaster, all gone. But it wasn't the names that haunted her most. It was the faces that hadn't been crossed out. Those were still alive, and that meant one thing. The man who had taken her in the silent benefactor was keeping a list, not of allies, but of targets. Over the next few days, Rosalind's world began to shift beneath her feet. Every knock on her door, every tray of food, every passing glance from the house staff felt heavier, like she was being watched not with concern, but with expectation, as if everyone knew what she'd discovered. Dan now waited to see what she'd do with it. Her baby, growing stronger, cooed beside her while she stood at the window each night, staring at the oiled derricks groaning in the distance. They looked like mechanical giants raising and bowing their heads endlessly to the earth, as if asking for forgiveness they'd never receive. Rossellini began to venture further. The mansion, massive and ornate, was shaped like a horseshoe, each in a world of its own. One side held the library, gallery, and her quarters. The other was locked until now. Doors that had once been sealed were mysteriously left ajar, and through them, she found more than she expected. First came the nursery. It was untouched, dustless, arranged with care. Toys hand-carved from rosewood, a rocking chair upholstered in velvet. On the far wall, a mural of stars painted above a crib that had never known sleep. Rossellini stood in the center and felt the walls tighten. Someone had prepared this room for a child long ago, but no child lived here. Then the gallery, not of art but of memories. Dozens of framed newspaper clippings, all cataloged by date and pinned in perfect order. The top left began with, "Warlords move into border settlement, local teacher missing." The bottom right ended with, "Mystery oil empire emerges in the south, no phase, nitrogen monoxide name." It was him, the benefactor, slowly and meticulously documenting the collapse of the life he'd once lived. His grief wasn't buried, it was curated. Each frame, a wound preserved. Each headline, a vow. Rossellini felt herself becoming part of that narrative, and that terrified her. That evening, she followed. The sound of boots across the marble floor. The benefactor was there, walking the corridor, trailed by a man in a bowler hat with papers in hand. They didn't see her, but she saw the exchange envelope passed, a nod returned. It was the language of quiet power, the kind that didn't need words. Later that night, a writer departed the estate under the cover of stars. Rossellini watched from the rooftop balcony. Something was in motion, and it had everything to do with her. The next morning, a gift was left on her table, a small, leather-bound ledger with no note. It was filled with names. Some had addresses. Some had dates beside them. Some were scratched out. At the end was a line. "Those who sold us for gold shall pay in oil." Rossellini slammed the book shut, heart pounding. She understood now. The benefactor wasn't just rich. He was reclaiming justice through industry, using his oil fortune not to forget, but to hunt. Each barrel funded the next move in his private war. He didn't trust the law. He was the law now, in secret, in silence. And she was the last survivor of a list that had once been longer. But something deeper stirred inside her. She began to question, was this redemption or revenge painted? In civility, that night, unable to rest, Rossellini crept to the lower wing, the part they called the archives. A cold, narrow hallway lined with steel cabinets and locked drawers. One was already open. Inside, A single photograph. It was her late husband, standing beside the benefactor, smiling, unaware. Rosalind's knees buckled. Her husband had once worked with him, and that meant the benefactor didn't save her by accident. He saved her to settle something unfinished. The photograph of her husband and the benefactor shattered something inside Rossellini that she hadn't realized was still whole. It was a simple picture, aged, torn at the corners, but it confirmed a truth she had never suspected. Her late husband, Elias Cade, the quiet schoolteacher who'd taught children to dream and healed broken minds after war, had once stood arm in arm with a man who now lived in shadows and vengeance. The smile they shared in the image was genuine, unguarded, not the kind shared by strangers. They had been brothers, or something close. Rossellini staggered from the archive, the cold air wrapping around her like a punishment. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap, one carefully laid long before she arrived. The benefactor had known who she was from the moment he saw her lying in the dust, baby pressed to her chest. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't kindness. It was legacy. That night, the mansion creaked under the weight of memories. Rossellini wandered its halls like a ghost, drawn by instinct, by pain, by the desire to unbury what had been hidden for too long. She found herself in the West Wing again, this time in a narrow corridor lined with portraits, none of them recent. The frames were golden, but cracked, their contents faded but recognizable. And in the center hung a painting nearly life-sized, covered in a drape that had not been moved in years. Rossellini reached for it. The cloth fell slowly, dust catching in the moonlight like ash. And there it was. Her husband, Elias, painted younger, stronger, and beside him the benefactor, though even then his eyes carried the weight of storms. Between them stood a woman Rossellini had never seen, tall, proud, pregnant. Beneath the frame, a brass plate read, "The dream that was taken." Her heart stopped. The woman was not her, and yet the child she carried, whoever it was, never came into this world. Or if they did, they had long vanished. Rossellini now understood. This mansion, this empire of oil and silence, had been built on heartbreak and betrayal. Not just of a town, but of a brotherhood. Elias had not merely been a friend to the benefactor. He had been family, and something between them had broken, long before the fires. She returned to her room, clutching her baby tighter, eyes wide open. For the first time, the child stirred against her chest, cooing softly, as if sensing the unraveling storm. The next morning, the benefactor appeared, not in shadow, not from behind, but in the courtyard, where the desert wind whipped through the stone pillars. He stood beside a fountain that hadn't flowed in years, staring down at its dry basin. Rossellini watched from her window. The man who had once moved like a ghost now stood exposed, aged not in body, but in soul. He looked like a man who'd carried too many tombstones on his back. And maybe he had. That evening, the mansion came alive. Trucks arrived at the estate's edge. Men unloaded crates, barrels, papers. A name kept repeating on their tongues. A mining syndicate, a corporate merger, a land auction, and over it all, one word: Vanguard. Rossellini asked no questions. She didn't need to. She already knew what was happening. The benefactor was preparing for war, not with weapons, but with ownership. He wasn't out to punish the past anymore. He was preparing to take back everything stolen from him and from her. That night, a maid left a box by Rosalind's bed. Inside was a sealed document, a deed. It named Rossellini and her daughter as joint inheritors of a large parcel of land untouched, oil-rich, and once owned by her husband. It had been taken during the raids, claimed by corrupt officers, and now it was being given back, signed only with an initial, J. The next morning, Rossellini stood in the nursery, but something had changed. The crib was gone, replaced by a cradle, new mahogany. lined with a quilt that bore her child's name stitched in gold thread. There were no more secrets. Now the benefactor had saved her not as an act of guilt, but as an offering, an apology for the part he played in what destroyed her world, and a plea for her to join him in rebuilding something better from the wreckage. Redemption wasn't offered to her, it was being shared. In the days that followed, Rossellini moved through the mansion like someone awakening from a long and haunted sleep. The linen wrappings had long been removed from her wounds, but now the deeper healing had begun, the one that came not from medicine, but from knowing the truth. Her story, once lost beneath ash and silence, had found its roots in this vast desert of glass and stone. She was no longer simply a refugee, no longer just a teacher turned wanderer with a baby and a graveyard behind. Her she was now a witness to something larger, something dangerous, something redemptive. And in the still hours of the morning, when her child slept without stirring, Rossellini sat with the deed papers on her lap. The land was real, the location mapped, verified, and the oil beneath it touched. The benefactor, a man she still only knew by his pain, had orchestrated every detail with precision, not just to honor Elias, but to make something new from the bones of what had been taken. She had spent her life fearing men who made wealth into weapons. But here was a man who had built an empire, not for glory, not for revenge, but as a tool to right a wrong too big for courts or Congress. Still, there were risks. Her name was on the documents. Public records would soon reflect her inheritance. And that meant the men who profited from her village's destruction would know she had survived. One afternoon, a letter arrived via private courier. No return address. Inside, a single photograph of Rosalind's daughter asleep, taken from outside the window. A warning. She didn't panic. She burned the letter in the fireplace. And then she packed her bags. By dusk, Rossellini and her baby were loaded onto one of the benefactor's black carriages, headed for the southern borderlands where the newly returned land awaited. The estate behind her shrank into the horizon. A cathedral of vengeance turned into a sanctuary for others like her. She didn't look back. The journey took 2 days across ravaged plains and old trade routes now controlled by cartels and ghost militias. But the benefactor had prepared for that too. Each mile marked by riders who cleared the road. Armed caravans passed them without a glance. No one touched her. She arrived at the property just after dawn. It was nothing like the mansion. Here, the land was wild, feral, thirsty, but beautiful. Acres of red clay soil dotted with greasewood and tall, brittle trees. A natural spring cut through the center, and beside it already built a small home with whitewashed walls, a porch, and wind chimes that sang without melody. The men who greeted her wore no uniforms, only brown leather gloves and wide-brimmed hats. Locals, loyal, not to the government, not to any sheriff, but to the cause. They called her ma'am. They helped carry the baby. They did not ask questions, because here, she was not just a mother. She was a keeper of legacy. The house held more than shelter. Inside were boxes marked with her husband's initials, things from their old life she thought lost. Forever books, a wedding scarf, a worn-out chalkboard from her schoolroom, with the alphabet still half written across it. Someone had saved these, preserved them, and now returned them. Not with a note, not with words, but with quiet reverence. It was that night, under a sky broken open with stars, that Rossellini finally allowed herself to dream. She saw the oiled derricks in the distance, not as machines of war, but as towers of resistance. Each one planted like a flag in soil stolen long ago. Each one reclaiming ground from the men who once laughed while towns burned. She began writing, again. Her journal filled with pages not of grief, but of intention, plans. A schoolhouse for the children of exiled families. A grain store built with iron and guarded day and night. A cemetery fenced and named. so no one's death would go undocumented again. And at the center, a single word carved into every wall: justice. But justice does not arrive quietly. 2 weeks later, she found footprints outside her window. Not those of the men who worked the land. These were deeper, heavier, military boots. And with them, a single bullet placed upright on her WINDOWSILL. Message. She was being watched. But this time, she did not run. She lit the lanterns. She raised the flags. And she sent a rider back to the benefactor. The wind came in hard that night, bending trees and rattling the windows of the whitewashed house like bones in a bag. Rosalini stood by the nursery cradle, arms wrapped around her baby, listening not to the wind, but to the silence behind it. The silence of men gathering in shadows. The silence of consequences drawing near, because frontier justice always came back round. And now the ones who once danced in the ashes of her village had realized the girl they left behind had returned, not with tears, not with fear, but with land, with oil, with purpose. At dawn, the horizon shifted. A black column of dust rose from the eastern ridge, winding like a snake toward her home. Trucks, many armed, uninvited. She didn't need binoculars to know who they were. The syndicate had sent them corporate vultures disguised as military muscle. The same men who profited from the land raids. The same ones who sat in parlors as villages bled. And now, faced with a woman they thought they'd buried in fire, they were coming to finish what they started. But this time, she was ready. Rosalini stepped outside with her baby still in her arms. The oilfield workers had formed a loose perimeter, quiet men with weather-worn faces, and rifles held casually but firmly. Not mercenaries, not killers, just men who had lost things too, and now stood beside a woman who represented the last chance to reclaim dignity in a world carved up by greed. When the trucks arrived, they didn't charge in. They stopped just shy of the property line, engines idling, dust curling up like steam. A man stepped out, dressed to clean for frontier country. He looked at Rosalini with the expression of someone used to people bending, yielding. But Rosalini didn't bend. Instead, she walked to the border, stood with her back straight and her child close, and made her decision without a word. And then, from behind the hills, came the sound of hooves. Dozens of horses, and behind them black carriages, polished and armored, bearing the crest of the benefactor. He had come, but he did not walk in front. He let Rosalini remain at the center, because this was her land now, her stand, her redemption. The standoff didn't end in bullets. It ended in silence, in realization, in retreat. The syndicate's men saw what they hadn't expected: a woman unshaken, backed not by soldiers or lawyers, but by truth, land rights, and power won the hard way. They had come to intimidate. They left knowing they were outmatched not just by oil or by wealth, but by conviction. By the time the trucks vanished into the dust, the sun had climbed high, burning away the morning chill. Rosalini turned and walked back to the porch. She didn't cry. She didn't celebrate. She simply sat, her child nestled to her side, and began writing again. Weeks passed, then months. The schoolhouse was built. The grain store opened. A community rose not from charity, but from shared loss. The oil pump not just profit, but purpose, funding homes, clinics, scholarships. The children who once wandered without shoes now learned to read under roofs built by the broken who chose to rebuild. And through it all, Rosalini remained, not as a relic of tragedy, but as a symbol of resistance, of justice, of what it meant to take exile and turn it into a kingdom. They began calling her the widow of redemption. She never liked the name, because she hadn't come here to be mourned. She had come here to rise. And somewhere, far beyond the ridge, the benefactor watched quietly. He had given her land, but she had given the land back its soul.